Humans have countless abilities, from driving cars to performing surgeries, building skyscrapers, and caring for others. But what prevents something else, someone else, from doing the same? This is Sophia, born on February 14, 2016, from the Hong Kong-based company Hanson Robotics. She's the most advanced human-like robot in the world, personifying our dreams for the future of artificial intelligence. With eerily realistic humanoid features and more than 60 facial expressions, Sophia was born with face tracking, emotion recognition, and robotic movements generated by deep neural networks. Artificial intelligence unlocks countless possibilities, to say the least, but there's certainly a darker side to the technology behind the buzzwords. Bias embedded within datasets and machine learning models can present itself in evil forms. IBM, together with the Linux Foundation, has set out to instill explainability, fairness, and overall transparency in AI in their initiative Trusted AI, headquartered in San Francisco, California. So I sat down with Animesh Singh, head of the Data and AI open source platform at IBM, to learn more about the importance of open source software and the Linux Foundation AI, also known as LFAI. Animesh leads IBM data and AI strategy and execution, both internally with Watson and IBM Cloud Private for Data, and externally in open source. He has worked on cutting-edge projects for IBM enterprise customers, with focuses on cloud and virtualization technologies, leading the design and development of the first IBM public cloud offering. Thank you so much for speaking with me today, Animesh. I'd love to just start by learning more about your experience at IBM and your involvement in Trusted AI, and also your experience in cloud and artificial intelligence.
Thanks for having me here, Anissa. I've worked, I would say, more than a decade in IBM on definitely multiple areas. A lot of my early career was spent in cloud computing, and then the second half, I'm doing a lot around data and AI, machine learning. That has been the focus area. And within this context, I would say, Trusted AI has been one of the major pillars around which I've been working, and IBM has been working as well. And this is, generally very important for us. If you think IBM has a history of tech for social good, and as part of that, history we have done right from the very early days. If you think, IBM actually participated, and there were around more than 4,000 IBMers involved in the moon landing project, right? Working collaboratively with NASA. We have, been working very closely with a lot of experts in tracking infectious diseases, etc. Of late, there is an initiative from IBM called Call for Code, right, where we are essentially doing a lot around disaster recovery. So it's a multi-year program. It's being run with United Nations and other partners, Red Cross, etc. And what we are doing as part of that program is essentially empowering developers to come up with ideas, right, to solve global challenges. And some of them can be in the areas of disaster recovery, which was a focus of the program in first year. Or some of them can be in areas of, like this year, what we are running is two. One is around climate change. The second is around COVID-19, right? What are the technologies and solutions developers can work together and come up with solutions, right, which can actually help ease the pain we are seeing across the world. So I think that history for tech for social good also translates why IBM has been so serious about Trusted AI. I got involved into this effort around 2.5 years ago. We were, IBM Research was working on quite a bit of projects, right, which were around this area. And then, as virtue of it, we decided it would make sense actually, for these projects to be in the community, right, for other developers to participate in, for other developers to be able to take a look at, what are the projects in trusted AI mean. And then, so by virtue of it, right, they should be in open source. So that's how my involvement started. So far, so good, right? We have rolled out multiple projects in this area and, you know, worked with multiple partners, right, in terms of advancing these projects.
Now, you mentioned open source, and I know how important that is in software in general. Why do you believe it's so important in specifically artificial intelligence?
So one of the things, like as I mentioned, right, when we started thinking about, how to grow these projects, so the areas which are going to be important, right? So if you think, the origin point of these projects is in IBM research, right? So research typically is, 2 to 3 years ahead of the curve. And then, okay, the technology is being developed in research, but we want to make sure, it's accessible to multiple developers and multiple users. And one of the virtues of, when we say that, you should have trust, you can't have trust in something, right, which is proprietary. If this is code which lives behind our firewalls, right, nobody can see, what are the algorithms, how are we using them, how are we flagging, whether your AI system is biased or, your AI system is vulnerable to adversarial attacks or your AI system cannot explain. If we keep them behind a firewall, that would have defeated the whole purpose, right? So I think it was very clear right from the beginning that, we should be moving them in open source, right? So that's, research and us, getting together. I'm part of a group in IBM called CODE, Center for Open Source Data and AI Technologies, right? So we formed that partnership, started moving these projects in open source, and we saw, a lot of great adoption by academia, by universities, by folks who actually want to inject these things in their algorithms. And then, from there on, a gradual progression. So I think, as you see, right, initially it became a trifecta between research and open source, and then a lot of the initial users, they started coming from academia, right, because there was a lot of courses which were being crafted, which were actually using these tools in universities. And then I think what we are seeing now is, the trend towards moving these things in production, right? In terms of being able to use them in production platforms. So I think, again, going back to your specific point, open source, as I mentioned, right, you can't have trust in something which is proprietary. B, the other area where we also felt after the projects were out for a couple of years that just moving a project in open source is not enough, right? It needs to be an open governance model. And what I mean by that is, if I'm going to choose an open source project and use it, but I know there is a vendor behind it, and the project is totally under their control. And tomorrow, they can go and change anything, and all of a sudden, dependency I've taken, I will have to rewrite and rebase everything. So moving a project in a neutral place like Linux Foundation or Apache, all these foundations gives a confidence to the end user that, hey, nobody is controlling, or not a single vendor is controlling this project. This project is in a neutral space, and you can be a co-participant, you can be owner of the project if you start contributing as well. So that was our next step in the journey, where we worked very closely with Linux Foundation, and we formed a trusted AI committee. So IBM joined Linux Foundation AI, and as part of that, we also formed a trusted AI committee. I'm one of the chairs, for North America for their trusted AI committee, and as part of that, now it has grown to more than, I would say, 13, 14 organizations, the likes of AT&T, Tencent, Huawei, Nokia, participating in it along with us, Orange. So we have, global participation, from North America, Europe, Asia, right? Multiple companies coming together and defining, what should be the guiding principles for trusted AI. And then, if these are the principles, what should be the tools, right? So that was our first step with Linux Foundation AI in open source. And then the second step, which we did with them, was actually taking these projects and moving them under the aegis of Linux Foundation, right? So that means the IP is now neutral, is owned by Linux Foundation AI, and IBM, is as much a participant in this as any other company would want to.
Can you explain more about the three components of trusted AI, the primary ones, explainability, robustness, and fairness, and whether you believe there are other components that you think are essential in developing trustworthy algorithms?
I mean, if you see, as you are aware, Anis, right, we are in a unprecedented time in history, right? There is a lockdown. People are asked to stay at home, and to mitigate this disease, right, with which we are all battling, right? There is a lot of surveillance going on. There is a lot of tracking required. Now, if you go to a lot of the airports across the world, they are using different kind of tracking mechanisms, biometrics tracking. There are video surveillance systems, right, to ensure other things. There are in some cases. I mean, I was surprised to read that you are actually being required to wear some monitoring anklets, right? So I think the general nature of this, what we are seeing, the trend is that in a lot of cases AI systems are being used to make decisions, and they are now collecting more data because the need of the hour is collect more data. And as part of that, right, we want to make sure, and in general, the world should, and the society as such should make sure that what we are doing with that data is done in an ethical and trusted way, right? So if you look at it, the first thing which comes to my mind is definitely bias, right? I mean, that is one of the key things, right, where we have focused right from the beginning. We want to be able to detect bias. We want to be able to mitigate bias and ensure that AI systems are not biased. If you have followed news articles over the course of last 2 years, 3 years, there have been multiple instances where biased AI systems are upending lives, right? And more so in this age of COVID, where we are collecting more data, we are invading more privacy because we need to ensure safety. It becomes all the more important. I mean, there are one of the things which we did, for example, when we rolled out AI Fairness 360, which is a tool, focused around bias detection and mitigation. One of the examples, hypothetical examples we had in there was that, how medical system is more biased, biased against towards people of color. It was a hypothetical example. There was a Jupyter notebook, right? And we launched that around 2 years ago. And last year, there was a big article in Wall Street Journal about, they're actually finding real world data around, hospital studies, how people of color are, biased against in medical system, less likely to get the care they need, or, more delayed care, right? Multiple instances. So so we know these things exist. In fact, there is a county in Florida, Broward County, right? So there was a study done there by ProPublica, where there was a software which was used to award criminal sentences there on the basis of their likelihood of reoffending. And what they found was, that data was again heavily biased towards non-Caucasians, right? Because historically, uh, that's the class of society, right, which has been entered into the database for more criminal offenses, but it was more likely, in fact, twice as likely to flag a non-Caucasian resident as a likelihood of reoffending on a criminal crime, which for the same misdemeanor, right? So heavily biased. We ran our tool set against it. We found um, multiple biases in that data set and how it is distributed. So I think this has been a strong focus on our side. The second project definitely is what we call adversarial robustness toolbox, and it is around ensuring that your models cannot be fooled against adversarial attacks, right? So what's happening in the industry is that you can adversarially modify inputs which you are feeding to your model, and even those adversarially modified inputs are not detectable to human eye. It's very, very easy to fool a model, right? So for example, if you are depositing a check for $161, let's say 161, it's very, very easy to generate an adversarial image of that check which says 767. For the human eye, it's 161. But for the computer, it's very easy to fool it to say it's $767. Right? So multiple of these cases, right, for adversarial generated images. Now, if you extrapolate them in scenarios like self-driving cars and etc., where they are supposed to make real-time decisions, and if they were trained on data which was either adversarially modified, or because of wear and tear, the images on which the model the car is using, those images were not up to the mark. It's very easy for them to detect or not detect a stop sign as a stop sign, or not detect pedestrians. So this is a very active field. We are actually also very closely working with DARPA as part of the initiative, right? So in terms of identifying different kinds of attacks, right? Evasion attacks, poisoning attacks, which can be done on the models. Then once we have identified, right, how do you actually mitigate? So I think throughout these tools, the focus is don't only detect, but give you capabilities to mitigate them, right? So there are multiple algorithms in terms of how to mitigate adversarial attacks and make your models more robust. And last but not the least, I think the field which is generally more uh, explainable is AI explainability, right? Which I think more people and most of the people are now familiar with the constructs where you shall explain a model's decision, right? So if a model is denying your admission to a university, or if your model is rejecting your resume, or even making more life-altering decisions, right? Where as I mentioned, right, I was giving you the example of the criminal justice system where a model is being used to award criminal sentences, right? You want that model to explain itself, right? Not only at a transaction level, definitely for an end user, right? It is important that to explain why my loan was denied, why my resume was rejected or accepted, right? I mean, but also for auditors, right? So one of the things which we are seeing more and more is that there is a human in the loop, and people who want to see the performance of these models or the predictions of these models over a period of time and how they are performing, right? So if there is over the course of last quarter, there are 15 loans which have been accepted, 30 which have been denied. Is the model consistent and using consistent criteria, right? So how to explain that to the auditors, right? So one is at a transaction level where the end user, you explain the transaction to the end user. The second is over a course of transactions, things where more auditors come in, right, and you want to explain to them how the model is performing. Then the third class is also developers, right? A lot of cases which are emerging now is people are doing transfer learning. So you're not starting from a scratch model. You are essentially starting from a base model that somebody else built. And if they happen to be neural network models or deep learning models, it's hard to understand, right, the code, right? So how do you explain to them before they start doing transfer learning and creating a more customized version of the model, which is specific to their domain, what this model does, right? So that's the third tool which we launched, AI Explainability 360, right? So in short, the three areas, where we initially launched code in the open source, AI Fairness 360, for bias detection and mitigation, adversarial robustness 360 for detecting adversarially generated attacks and being able to mitigate them, and then AI explainability 360 so as to be able to explain model predictions at transaction level as well as over a course of transactions.
Wow.
And there is a fourth area, right, where we don't have code, right, but there are a lot of research papers. There is a website, what we call AI fact sheets, uh, and that plays more in the area of when you think in terms of like when you buy a food product, right? You get a list of ingredients, what goes into that food product, right? So it's the same concept being taken, in the context of AI, so that when you're using an AI model, there should be a bill of materials. What was used to build that model? What data set was used? What framework was used? Like for example, TensorFlow. What version of TensorFlow? What hyperparameters were used? How was the data, schema generated? How was the feature generated? Right, so you want to make sure that everything is tracked for that particular model before consumer starts using that model. So that's the concept behind, AI fact sheets. Yeah.
You touched upon academia a bit. So I wanted to ask, how do you think, I know in CS classes at Brown University, for example, we definitely delve into some of the algorithms you mentioned, like the resume one, Amazon's from a couple years ago, and also in the judicial system. How can we incorporate trusted AI into our curriculum?
There are two areas, right? So when you say, in terms of the curriculum, right, definitely being able to understand what it means or what it means, right, when we call, the AI should be trusted or ethical, right? Where are we? What are we talking about? What are the different criterias, right? So, I mean, I talked about definitely three of them, which is and four, in fact, right? But there are other areas, right? A lot of the universities we are seeing is, in some cases there are 7 or 8 pillars around which they want to define, what are the boundaries of trusted AI. The one thing is, I would say at this point there are no boundaries. I mean, yes, fairness, explainability, adversarial detection, uh, being able to track the lineage of the models is where, we are focusing a lot within IBM. But there can be other areas like, drift detection, anomaly detection, which is also, areas where we focus on, and a lot of universities are, creating courses around all these different, combining these different elements, and then picking, technologies which hopefully exist in open source. What we have seen, in our partnership with universities is that they have crafted courses, and we are seeing, more thrust, I would say, around the bias and the explainability to begin with, right? And as they move into more advanced phases of the curriculum, then they talk about, adversarial robustness or drift detection, anomaly detection, right? More advanced topics, right? But definitely, it's happening. The other part is, even in what we are seeing this year is, is a shift towards from, main Fortune 500 companies in terms of adopting these principles, right? So there is a big retailer in US, right, which is using, for example, one of our products called Watson Open Scale, which is based on AI Fairness 360, for bias detection in their HR scenarios, right, in their hiring practices, right. So they are ensuring that they're going through the data for their hiring practices, and ensuring that, they're not biased against a particular race, against a particular gender, as and when they are hiring, right. So that's, one way. We had a partnership with Wimbledon, right, where there was a lot of analysis done by these tools to ensure that, the highlights which are being surfaced are not being crowded by, superstar players, right? I mean, definitely if you have a Rafal or Serena Williams, right? I mean, their highlights will probably, just bubble up to the top, but there are a lot of emerging players, right, who are playing as good games, in some cases better, right? But how do you ensure that, there is not a bias in the system, right, which is just keeping them down, not surfacing their videos up as terms of the highlights, right? And it's being determined by a lot of things, right? The clapping, the general attendance of the audience, right? But different use cases, right, where we are working with different partners, right? There is a financial institution which we are working with, which is around, the constructs of AI governance, which is, the concept which I talked about around AI fact sheets, right? They want to make sure they have the lineage of everything right up to the point when the model is deployed in production, so that, if it makes a wrong decision, or even if it makes a correct decision, right? These agencies or these financial institutions, or in some cases government institutions, right? They are required by law to have auditability, right? A lot of the compliance requirements require you to have, auditability traces, right? So lineage becomes very important in that case. I definitely mentioned, the work which is happening with DARPA, right, which is U.S. Defense Organization, in terms of taking adversarial robustness 360 toolkit, right, and use it to prevent adversarial attacks on AI. So yeah, I mean, we see being used in production now. And academia, definitely were the first ones to adopt and start evolving courses on top of it. And we would love to have, something with Brown as well, right? For example, where, we can have a collaboration so that these toolkits can be used within that as part of that curriculum there.
I'd love to learn more just about your research going forward and what you think is the future for trusted AI.
Moving forward, what I see and what probably is going to happen more and more is new rules and regulations coming into place. Like just, what happened with GDPR, right, which was uh, a set of, European criteria and rules around, how you should handle data processing within your organization, which is handling personal sensitive information about end users, right? So there were a lot of rules put out around GDPR. What I see happening more and more is, there is already, discussions happening in the European Union as part of it, right, where what sort of laws and regulations should be put around so that, AI should be ethical and trusted. There is, multiple countries coming together and forming coalitions. There was a news last month where, India, Australia, and a host of other countries, came together to form this Ethical AI Foundation. So, as this is now becoming the need of the hour, and I think that world is not going away, right? We will be collecting more data. We will be building AI systems, and AI systems are going to make life-altering decisions for you, right? And while they're doing it, one thing we need to ensure is that it's being done in a trusted and ethical way. Now, one way to ensure is definitely make people aware and ensure it's a more organic adoption. But I think one thing which also needs to happen is the raw rules and the laws and the regulations tightening around this, and which is what we see happening more. And that's where once these guidelines and regulations and I would say more than the guidelines, right? The policies come into practice where you are required to comply. We will see, more and more adoption in the production systems, right? So I think a lot of work going forward on our side. Definitely, there is quite a bit of work happening within IBM research in terms of creating more advanced algorithms, right? But I think now that we are at the cusp where more models are being rolled in production, there are rules and regulations coming in place. We'll see a lot more focus on how to leverage these technologies in production, right? So parts of our team, for example, have been working with something called Kubeflow, which is an open source project for production machine learning, right? Doing distributed training and model serving and inferencing in production. And we have been, integrating these projects there. So folks who are, deploying models in production using Kubeflow, for example, they can leverage these trusted AI capabilities. If you're running machine learning pipelines in production, right, which is automating the whole machine learning lifecycle, we are creating, technologies to be able to consume that there, right? So a lot of the work now being, focused towards production-like systems. Obviously, as I mentioned, we have Watson OpenScale within IBM, which is focused on that area. And then, as laws and regulations kick off, then we'll see more tightening around standardization efforts, right? So I think in general the industry, IBM was a pioneer, right? We were I would say first to go out with tools around bias detection and mitigation. Now that is 2 years down the line, we see some of these projects springing up in the industry, and pretty soon once we start hitting these regulations, we'll see more standardization activities happening where, hey, we need to standardize around a set of APIs for bias detection or mitigation, or we need to standardize around a set of APIs around explainability, right? So I see that happening as well. So yeah, the three things which I would say is move towards production, more regulations and laws kicking in, and the third thing is essentially where you will be required in general, right, to comply with some of these things. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Animesh, for speaking with me today. I really learned a lot myself and can't wait to keep following your efforts at Trusted AI.
Thanks for having me here, and hopefully, we can continue taking this collaboration forward, right, with at your end as well. And definitely, thanks for all your interest and passion in this field, right? We are relying a lot on the next, generation of tech folks, right? People who are going into the technology field, or people who will be building the next generation of AI systems and models, right, to be actually taking some of these constructs more organically, right, and ensure that what we are building in base layers of AI today, which is going to affect decisions for the next decade or 2 decades, right? Because once it's baked into the base layer, very hard to change, right? So uh, you're relying a lot, on the next generation of folks going into the technology field, building next generation of AI models, AI systems, to ensure, right at the outset, trusted and ethical AI is the foundation of any work they start in the AI field.